Hey everyone, this is Craig from Asset Horizon here. Before we get into today's episode, just a brief reminder that in May, Timothy Jackson's spring course at Asset Horizon Research Commons opens. It's called Ontogenesis is Impossible, and it goes deep into questions of individuation, improvisation, and evolutionary science. Just drop down into the show notes for more information, and I will let Adam take the rest from here. Okay, let's listen.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. Now, today we're mostly thinking about how to organize for a new world, and that seems kind of basic at this point to the extent that we all kind of want a new world, but then again, how do we organize this desire into a militant force? How do we understand this desire, and how do we translate it not simply into a clinical study of our own drives for revolutionary fervor or the changed material living circumstances, but how do we translate this into new organizations, new institutions that escape from the programmings of the past, becoming neither horizontal nor vertical? And how do we think about the history of how we try to research these new forms of institution? Well, luckily, there were such institutional sort of research structures in our time, or rather in our previous time, around the 68 revolt and its afterlives. And particularly today, we're going to be talking about CERFI in French, in English, the Centre for Institutional Studies, Research and Training, about new ways of forming different kinds of collective equipment for our desires in terms of how to organize ourselves for social change in the here and now. And I'm glad to be joined by Susana, Caló and Godofredo Pereira, who wrote this new book, Analysis Everywhere, about CERFI and the prospect of militant analysis outside of the clinic, and drawing on such folks as, for example, Félix Guattari, noted friends of the show. And you can actually get this book now out of our friends over on Minor Compositions. Big up, Stephen, as always. Susana, Godofredo, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
So just to start off, I know this is a massive question, if not the question of the book, but what was, in sort of a compressed form, the Centre for Institutional Studies, Research and Training? How particularly, how does it arise out of sort of militant movements around the solidarity struggles in France, for example, the movement in support of Algerian independence, the anti-Vietnam War movement? One of my favorite things about the book as well, you mentioned it also comes from, particularly in relation to Guattari, a particularly Trotskyist wing of the youth hostel movement, which in the UK, Trotskyists have done everything, but we've never done like hospitality, I'll say that.
So what is in a condensed way, maybe I'll start there. In a condensed way, CERFI was a research cooperative, essentially, that was created in 1967 and more or less, let's say, formally ended around 1984, right? And this is, to give a sense, is a research cooperative mostly cited in Paris, around Paris, so in France, that brings together, or that brought together, at a certain point, more than 60 people, even though there was a kind of a core group. And thus far, CERFI has emerged or appeared here and there around one of its key figures, Félix Guattari, and his biography, or people who are more in-depth into the footnotes of his work. And sometimes people doing some research on Foucault, for example, who collaborated with the book on Deleuze. And so one of the main ambitions for us in doing this book, well, it was our own interest in its authors that actually brought us there, but us being able to move beyond this, a history told through individual figures, and actually kind of collective, very practical history around it. Now, if I can now unpack a bit more what is meant by this research cooperative, I think it's important to understand what brings it together, actually. And I think that's what you're alluding to in your question. So part of it, we can go and we see, let's say there's a massive student mobilization, and particularly militant organizing through student unions and through actually a multiplicity of other union type of academic or para-academic organizations taking place or emerging in France in support of Algerian liberation, actually. And there's a tension there between the support for Algerian liberation struggle and political organizations, namely the French Communist Party, that wasn't so clear about the nature of their support, to put it mildly. And then historians will differ on what actually was PCF's position on that, but basically from the perspective of many student movements, PCF wasn't supportive at all, actually. And so in one sense, you have student movements starting to organize and to constitute research centers and research organizing within the student movement, so a kind of multiplication of student organizations that started looking at their own conditions beyond the main discourses of, let's say, leftist geopolitics, third world Marxism. They're looking at sex conditions, they're looking at health, they're looking at suicides in the student milieu, they're looking at all sorts of pragmatic conditions of daily life, actually. And then within that, they make an invitation to a group that was part, let's say, to a group that was aligned with the institutional psychotherapy movement in France, which is really important that we can bookmark, let's say, from Saint-Albin to Laborde, with figures such as François Fanon, François Tosquelles, Georges Canguilhem, a series of figures that were perimetral or central to it, and whose core aspect was that before looking at the mad, we need to understand that the institution itself needs treatment, the institution is ill. I won't go much into that now, if not this preamble becomes a lecture in itself. But so there's this encounter between the institutional psychotherapy movement and student groups that invited them to address these questions that had to do more with mental health, for example. And that's where he comes in as a catalyst for a series or a more in-depth series of encounters, right? That he himself he has a biography that is very well known. He enters into the world of institutional psychotherapy not because of an analytical psychology, psychiatry, whatever degree, but actually by being an activist. And he's invited to join Laborde precisely due to his capacity to create, to energize, and to activate the institution therapeutically, so to speak. So out of this encounter, and again, it's an encounter in which, while it was very important to demonstrate and articulate to as much as possible solidarity with struggles in Vietnam, solidarity with struggles in the third world, there's a lot of reflection in terms of what is leftist politics in France, what is the communist movement in France, but also a lot of reflection on what are actually the sides of politics that we inhabit and what's at stake with that. Two organizations came out of that. One is called left-wing opposition, so Opposition de Gauche, and the other one is a kind of rhizomatic federation of multiple organizations. And so the point of these two organizations is actually one was capturing marginal activists, bringing together, actually not necessarily capturing, but bringing together activists or militants in the margins of many other organizations, militant organizations, but those that were really interested in this encounter with Marx and Freud, as they normally bookmark it, right? They're interested in questions of the unconscious, which many militants, not just in the Communist Party, but also in Trotskyist organizations and groups, were really not that interested in going into, right? There was a kind of an object of research, an object of militant critique. And as Anne-Carien would say at the point, spending time with the mad and delinquent was really not in their list of priorities as part of a revolutionary process. So Opposition de Gauche brings these groups together. And the group comes together in a way because Guattari, out of these encounters, invites a lot of militants to spend time at Laborde, to spend time in this very unique clinical setting, which is again, we can speak more later, but is a clinic that's practicing institutional psychotherapy, in which the point is that what is therapeutic is creating little institutions within the institution, collective analytical processes within the institution. This is very important space, non-normopathic at all, that, as you might imagine, was really transformative for young militants, right, in their early 20s, some of them already a bit older, but let's say very young in general, and led to the cohesiveness of this encounter. So a couple of things more. So out of Opposition Gauche, then more importantly, FGERI and Opposition Gauche, they both emerged in 1965. FGERI is more in the form of a federation, right? Opposition Gauche is a small group. They have the same people inside, more or less. But in Opposition Gauche, they're coming together, and I think their main output is this small text that is a collective text that thus far has been assigned authorship exclusively to Guattari, which is not correct. It's called the 9 Theses of the Left Opposition. And it's a collective text in which they identify, they provide an overview of their critique to leftist organizations, namely kind of reliance on the figure of the state in terms of decolonization struggles going on throughout the world, but also bureaucratic crystallizations in terms of their own organizations, right? And the question that they pose is often how you cannot simply be a revolutionary out there in terms of Vietnam and then hit your wife at home, right? Or be a macho, fascist, patriarchal, whatever it is, right? So they would identify this massive disconnection, and not all students and not all militants at the time were really into engaging with their own unconscious as part of a militant struggle. And so to finish explaining a bit how they come together, so there's Opposition Gauche, there's FGERI, which is they start understanding that militant revolutionary processes cannot only take place by participating in a meeting with a party or with the union. They have to take place at home, in your professional setting, in the street, whatever it is. So FGERI is another organization that's created that brings multiple professional militant groups, object-oriented groups, if you can, with multiple types of groups. So there's no logic of similar types of groups from across France. And it is from FGERI that CERFI emerges at a certain point. When within discussions within FGERI, they organize a series of conversations and meetings around a kind of a demand from the state to program mental health equipment in France and psychiatric equipment. And people from different groups from FGERI come together to debate those demands. Why this demand? Why do you need 10 hospitals or 5 hospitals or even an hospital at all, right? What is the logic of the demand from the side of the state more than the actual demand itself? And out of that, CERFI emerges as a possibility of, very simply speaking, well, we could pitch some ideas and get funding and be able to bring some of the principles or analytical principles that we want to bring in from institutional psychotherapy into militancy, from militancy into institutional psychotherapy, and from there beyond, let's say, either of these spaces, clinical on one side, militant on the other, forget about that, everywhere. So CERFI comes from that a bit.
I just wanted to add something, which is maybe it's important to say that, and I was just thinking about this listening you speak, kind of CERFI, we say this in the book, but now it became very clear, even more clear to me, that they have not decided to make a research center. They have not decided to make a research corp and think, this is what we want to do, want to be researchers, and this is what we want to do. It was the fruit of kind of the pragmatic conditions as well. There's this opportunity to continue to participate in struggles together, to be together. And there's this opportunity because the French state is investing in independent research groups that might be proposing new research projects. So why not? Let's do it. And I think that's really important as well to say.
Yeah, it really strikes me with this idea of putting the institution itself under analysis and also avoiding sort of bureaucratic crystallization. Because when we hear institutions often, especially in a sort of post-68 milieu, we're sort of like, okay, that's a crystallization that inherently is crystallizing. It's sedentary, it's not nomadic. We want to be, I don't know, all can't catch me kind of thing, always constantly running from the cops, but eventually you do have to sort of sit down at some point. But one of the things that I really appreciate with what CERFI were trying to do as well, and the way you presented it, is how, especially when it comes to militant organizing, the analysis of the institution itself or the organization itself is so often, I mean, basically, most leftist organizations happen from a site of trauma because they're splits from other leftist organizations, and it's usually a big fight, and that's how it gets started. If it wasn't that, it's the traumatic conditions that make you militant in the first place. And so I really appreciate this framework of like, well, we've all got ourselves in this room, we're all pretty fucked up by everything that's gone on. Should we consider that? No, let's all export it into this sort of model of a future state to come. And it really does get into sort of the heart of why we need this kind of research, which is, not for simply research's own sake. Otherwise it'd be a think tank.
Just to intercede in one way you're speaking, I'm reminded nowadays in the militant groups that I inhabit, the multiplication, the way that WhatsApp allowed us, unfortunately, to even splinter that into parallel WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal groups, each with their own institutional formations. But I think one point needs to be made at the start of this conversation, which is in French. Let's say in English, we tend to associate the institution very much with the constituted,
Yes.
right? With the race, particularly associated with the state even more, right? But in French, they would most often than not at this time use the word établissement, establishment in a way to speak of those. An institution is, we could often call it organization as well, but it could also be the fact that the four of us decide to meet in a pub for 3 months, right? And we decide, let's institute to repeat something.
I just wanted to say quickly, now that's an institute I could get down with. I'm sorry to cut you off. Please continue.
No, but that's the beauty of it, right? Because we tend to think of institutions as this kind of in the Sartrean Guattari at the time, right? You have the subject group and the subjective group, and you have this kind of crystallization, right, and etc. So it all dies. Whereas this institutional psychotherapy in Laborde is actually, well, let's just create more, and then if they die, they do. But you keep on, so you don't analyze the institution per se as much as the creation of institutions has an analytical capacity. So Acid Horizon would be an institution in a way. And the constant way in which we invent new things as part of Acid Horizon is an institutional process, so to speak.
And it kind of proliferates as well in these micro institutions as well. And it's really important because we tend to get really stuck with the idea of institution, like the institution with the capital I. But the way they spoke about the institution is very inspiring. It's kind of rhythms, it's kind of meeting points. And it's not about the institution itself, but it's about the process of creating institutions, diverse institutions, to allow for desire to be inscribed or to be grasped. So there has to be many, because there's many.
And the Kunis have all stopped listening right now. They hear institution, they're just like, no, we're done. Acid Horizon, captured. Sorry, Craig.
This raises the question then of the actual practices and procedures of the institution as such. And I'll start by saying that one of the things that attracted me to Guattari's work early on was, well, transitioning from an early interest in psychoanalysis and then becoming radicalized, I would say, in the wake of that, and then wanting to find a framework through which I could sort of square the circle of psychoanalysis and radical politics. And so when I first discovered Guattari's work, it was quite inspiring. And of course, in the Anglophone world, perhaps our resources are limited in terms of translations of materials available to us. I mean, when it comes to the concept of psychoanalysis and transversality, we're afforded a volume that's available on Semiotext by that title called Psychoanalysis and Transversality. And some of my early research while doing my master's degree forced me to cleave rather closely to that book. I did a lot of work on Guattari, and one of the things that really struck me was the notion of eliciting a group unconscious, maintaining the concept of a subject group and not becoming what Guattari calls a subjugated group. And I'd like to explore what that means in practice for Guattari. And I also want to perhaps highlight the risks involved with eliciting a group unconscious. I'm fresh off the heels of reading several texts by Baudrillard, and there is a point, I believe it's in the book, the compilation of essays called Forget Foucault, where he enunciates this idea that Deleuze and Guattari are all about putting the unconscious into the free air. And this is the problem with their system of productivist philosophy and political economy, is that it's about these enunciations, about sort of exposing oneself, about making everything less opaque and more transparent. And I was wondering if that dynamic in the institution itself actually engendered a risk where enunciating these latent or inchoate desires actually brought about conflicts that were irreconcilable or irresolvable in some way. So I was hoping that maybe you could give me the sort of picture of the good and the bad of that practice.
I mean, I have many thoughts regarding that question of yours. And one of them, and I've also kind of studied quite a lot of Guattari when I was doing my PhD, went through the psychoanalysis and transversality. And that was kind of trying to understand that issue of the group, kind of eliciting the group, and then went to do research on Sartre to kind of tend to understand the differences and all. And at a certain point, Guattari kind of stop speaking about the group to speak about this new concept that emerges in his work of collective assemblages of enunciation. And that has to do much more or less with a group of people, but with kind of a way of analyzing a certain situation and kind of bringing to the fore a series of dimensions beyond language, right? So when I see kind of in terms of the practical work that was being developed at Laborde, and as a clinic which was practicing institutional psychotherapy, what you see is a proliferation of institutional mechanisms, some of them autonomous from each other, right? And the purpose was, you could say that it was kind of to work at that level of collective subjectivity, or to see that kind of collective emerge, but the emphasis is much more on the process of emergence than the collective itself, because then the collective can be dissolved and recomposed with others. So it's always a matter of not one group, but with groups of groups, right? Do you have any more thoughts about this?
No, I think there's
question.
There was a point there, right? And I think there's elicitation is not transparency. And I think that's the first point that I would make. So at Laborde, for example, when you have a mechanism, and they had very interesting, and that's something that transposes to CERFI quite a lot, which is an interest in administrative procedures, not as something that, and then someone does the phone or administration, but actually as processes that enter debate, simply to be able to start channeling and breaking some crystallizations and over-identifications. And so for one of those is something that Susana has written about quite extensively, which is the grid, which is essentially a schedule of activities at Laborde, right? Who does the cleaning? Who does the laundry? The way in which those mechanisms come into a collective discussion by the monitors in Laborde and etc., or similar mechanisms come then in collective discussion by the club that was led by patients, what we do with the money, what we do this and etc. There are mechanisms to, in one way, allow making visible, so to speak, not just the group unconscious, but then very quickly, this Guattari is speaking in terms of the institutional unconscious, actually. And very quickly, so forget institutional is machinic and not stuck in the institution anymore. So there's a kind of this movement from institutional psychotherapy to institutional analysis to schizoanalysis, so to speak, in his work. But those processes, bringing into visibility is not bringing into transparency. And that was actually quite important particularly for Jean-Henri, right? Of course, Guattari had a much more productivist and dynamic, very much high-speed creation dynamic. And Henri was a very interesting balance at Laborde, who was a person very much concerned with the importance of dark places, the kind of a hatred that both of them had with, in architectural terms, for transparency, the violence of transparency. And so I think it's important to understand the conceptual production that Guattari is doing at the time as incredibly inspired and conceptual production towards what is happening in Laborde, right? Where the concept of transversality then emerges from, together with an ecology of that concept. And so what you have is a passage between transference, right? Which is, you point out to the psychoanalytical component of it, right? And classical psychoanalysis transference is a kind of dual patient-doctor relationship, so on and so forth. At Laborde, what they're interested with institutional psychotherapy is a kind of an expanded transferential field, an institutional transference, that they produce concepts such as institutional transference, lateral transference. These are all concepts that start emerging at Laborde. Ginette Michaud uses the concept of institutional transversality. They didn't care about coining. As part of their conversations, he writes a report as part internal, not published. I think it took her 10 years or something to decide publishing it in Laborde around transversality, that then where Guattari picks it from. And so they're trying to explode transference from this dual relation in psychoanalytical terms. And therefore, I'm throwing this back at you to go back to the point of eliciting and the danger, right? So the dare is not to elicit to interpret, neither to elicit to make visible in a way that would expose. At least that was not the purpose of it. It was in a way that could be constantly worked and worked and worked. And it had to do with the fact there's a clinical environment in which you work essentially with psychosis, right? And therefore, interpreting where the psychosis comes from doesn't really do much. What from them was interesting is always cartographing other pathways. Okay, so let's go in that direction then. Maybe it's possible, let's go. And so just to conclude there, one of these administrative mechanisms and something, I don't know, that you pick up quite a lot is, for example, in their discussions why people really wanted to do the laundry. Of course, we know why everyone likes the kitchen, but yeah, a lot of people wanted to do the laundry and a lot of people wanted to do this. What was interesting for them was to understand, is there any negative identification? But in this case, there was joyful identification, right? Because maybe temperature or the sound or whatever. But it is not towards interpreting what's the laundry in terms of the Oedipal triangle of your mommy, daddy. Not that at all, is anti-interpretative. And so if there are things brought into being worked, it's not brought into visibility towards exposure in those terms. I don't know if that touches on what you're trying to reach.
No, that's great. In fact, I'm going to pass it to Adam for now, but I will pick up a point on that a little bit later on.
I just wanted to pick up on the strand particularly of transversality and this idea of bringing transference into. We think of institutional and audience establishment as saying that all of our members are this, there is a universality to it, and then using something like transversality to complicate that with an analytic framework that makes it more of an exchange. So mostly because I'm very rusty on transversality, and I'm going to apologies to you, assume that they might be as well. Could we unpack a little bit about this concept of transversality and exactly how it applies to their general approach to institutional analysis and their not militarization of it, their militant approach to it?
I think there's a simple way to understand transversality if one has institutional psychotherapy framework in mind and psychoanalysis. So transference, the concept that is most associated with psychoanalysis, at the time was strongly associated with a dual relationship between patient and a therapist or an analyst and an analysant. and it operated through language, right? So if you are working at the level of the institution, right, in which the purpose is to reimagine care from a collective perspective in which the whole institution or institutions is the healing collective, then it makes no sense to keep this focus on language and to keep this focus on this dual mechanism of transference in which there's two people, right? So they reshaped the concept. So rather than saying, they thought that in the environment, in the intellectual environment in which they were operating, psychoanalysis, strongly influenced by Freud and Lacan, it was necessary to invent a new concept. And this is the concept of transversality that appeals to relations of affection beyond the linguistic, the semiotic and the material, and that reinvents the frame of the analytical relationship. It has not to do with two people, but with an environment. You can speak about environment as a therapeutic agent without being necessarily framed as so. And it's interesting to say as well, because it makes sense for people interested in the theory of these things and in the philosophy, that it's a very operational concept. It's produced because it's needed, right? They really need a different concept. And it's something that has, collective genealogy as well. So Godofredo mentioned Jeanette Michaud. She was working at Laborde, and it was in 1958, so 20 years until she published this book in which she calls about, I think it's a polyfunctional transversality.
Yeah, something like that.
And then this was a document that was shared among people that working in Laborde, and it was debated collectively as concepts were pragmatic constructions in Laborde as well. They were part of the analytical work. And then it kind of makes appearances as well in discussions. You mentioned of Sherry, which is that federation, it makes appearances in their discussions as well. The reinvention or the need to invent a different concept that's not the concept of transference. It makes appearances before in Toscaires with the institutional transference. So it's kind of this moment that Transversality captures all of that. And then it's mostly associated with Guattari because then he publishes an essay before Jeanette Michaud publishes her work. And that essay, I think, appears in Psychoanalysis Transversality. So it's a collective production in a way. But Transversality, that's what it is. It's a practice, analytical practice that goes beyond the strict focus on language and that kind of duality and the relationships between, you mentioned it at the beginning, the horizontal and the vertical as well. And then they transpose that to their modes of research as well. So if we think that the aim in an analytical informed institution is to create institutions so that desire and consciousness are inscribed and then can be worked upon, then we need to create the many institutions and the quasi-institutions, etc. So their processes of work, which is a process of research, was also through those institutional mechanisms. So they thought about the way they organize themselves. So inside CERFI, there was multiple institutions. There was multiple groups of subgroups. And when they practiced research, it was never to practice research on an institution, or there was never that separation between us and them. It was from the start a practice of transversality. So you kind of start imagining these institutions and start intervening at that level.
They would also mention one expression that's very important. They'll try to understand certain processes in terms of their coefficient of transversality. And that was just a kind of another way of mentioning, let's say, what is at stake with picking on the previous example with a laundry, right? The laundry room, since it's a collective through which doctors, nurses, carers, everyone in the institution goes through, and collectivizing processes in the institution allowed to work a lot of these things, becomes an analytical process, an analytical device, so to speak, right? As important as certain conversations that are private that kept on happening, of course, there's still dual analysis happening at Laborde, as important as it is to discuss collectively how should we open the door to the kitchen or not, as important as it is to discuss collectively who's mowing the lawn and what to do with the horses and the chicken coop and all of that. So all of those became analytical devices. And depending on the case, some of them gain more preponderance than others, right? In some cases, it is the conversation still in a classical discursive way. In other cases, it's really walking around in the park or climbing trees, right? So Laborde worked all of them in a way. So this was very important for CERFI. And before that also for Guattari, saying, well, we're not doing institutional psychotherapy. We're doing institutional analysis, actually. So it's a kind of analytical multiplication. So you understand, so as part of institutional analysis is all sorts of conversations that might emerge around cutting the trees, right? Because it might catalyze, open up something's happening there. So let's keep on going. Let's organize a group to cut trees.
Yeah. So I'm just going back to kind of in my mind thinking about the previous question where conflict was mentioned. For example, in the grief, there was lots of conflict, of course. You're being timed to do things that maybe you didn't want to, but there was and conflict was brought to the fore. But if we think of conflict as an analyzer, not as the thing itself, but as a way to kind of to analyze and to grasp unconscious desires and to see what's in there, right, and catalyze them, then you can see how conflict is not the conflict, but it's what you do, what it kind of allows to do with it, what comes to the fore rather than being silenced. Does it make sense?
It does. And if it simply places conflict as something to be expected, not something to be resolved.
Yeah, and kind of
and I think that's a key shift, which does not mean that we're not incredibly difficult conflicts in whatever case, right? But analysis is not conflict resolution. That's not the point. And it's not conflict dissipation. It's actually work through conflict. That we say it often, a conflict is in a way in the situation of collectives, right? Because then we have this kind of this original question in terms of militant organizing, right? There's an expectation not to have conflict and to quickly resolve conflict. And what I think is manifest and latent in CERFI is that conflict is a necessary part of that process, and it cannot come as a surprise, right?
Plus, it varies a productive feature as well. It's something that you do.
I'd like to actually go back a bit to the distinction that was made between transparency and visibility as a function of elicitation, and the claim that Jean-Uri made regarding maintaining a sort of darkness or opacity about certain things. I'm very interested in this, and I'm wondering if it's connected to Guattari's concept of vacuoles of non-communication. And I also would like to attach this to certain questions, problems, inquiries that have actually come to my desk with regard to organizing in-person events, collective gatherings, and so forth. I live in a rural space right now. That wasn't always the case for me. And I do some sort of, I guess you would say, kind of cultural organizing with like-minded folks where I live. And the question has been put forward to me whether or not I would be willing to host sort of events or gatherings in a sort of bucolic space where people could come escape the fetters of modern technology, the demands that AI and things are making upon us. And there's a sort of fantasy circulating in the space where we're at right now, where well, let's do something like a retreat. Let's convene in these spaces where we can think differently, escape from these apparatuses of capture and so forth. And one of the risks that I see in doing that is I think these bucolic lines of flight could potentially invite a kind of political quietism, this sort of agrarian mentality, like where we can just shelter ourselves from it all. And so it's a sort of risk analysis that I'm undertaking by myself as I'm about to have conversations about how to do things like what we're going to call a read-in, where people just show up to a space for a weekend where we read together. We're not on mobile devices. We're having conversations. We're doing things in a sort of tangible third dimension sort of way. But at the same time, I can see a certain bourgeois mentality filtering into that sort of activity. I've given you quite a lot to work with, everything from opacity, vacuoles of non-communication, and real questions and inquiries that I'm dealing with. How would somebody at Laborde or in Guattari's mindset sort of deal perhaps with the challenges that I'm facing?
So many answers. Some of them stretch far beyond the confines of this conversation. So a lot of my own activism is in rural context. So I understand very much where you're coming from, but maybe I'll start the other way around. So in terms of the vacuole, one of the interesting things, and where the term often appears associated to, is one of these kind of Labordian, Guattarian, and then CERFian attempts of converting every bureaucratic moment into an analytical machinery. And so is the organization of meetings. And particularly the importance of organizing meetings with no agenda. What matters in the meeting is the commitment to be there, even if on the day you spend, and they'll describe like that, half an hour until someone started speaking, because there's not like a list of an hour, all of this that were the meetings that they're perhaps more used to being part of. And so that void, they'll describe it as a void that was empty, but empty as a way to be filled, right? And to be filled is not necessarily to be filled by discourse. So there's different ways of filling. And an analytical kind of work has to do with understanding that, even Guattari would say, is a beautiful quote, even the silence of the catatonic is a mode of participation, right? But what we mean by participation is not that participation, now is your turn to speak. And so there's no model for that. But the creation of this void that can be filled in, opened up, is all part of analytical processes, and it has to do with a certain sensibility and attention, right, as well, to why someone, he has this beautiful thing, why someone spends time in a corner of the staircase looking at the window. Maybe it's a very important thing, perhaps, that doesn't need to be ask to explain in order not to kill it, because that might hold on to something. So analytical practices, there's a question in the Deleuze and Guattarian version of it, which would be to say, discover your own desiring machines. That's maybe the desiring machine is in that time spent in the staircase, right? And sometimes interpreting kills things away constantly, right? It puts you in a position of explaining it away and losing that connection. So they do more of it rather than less. And so the factual often appears as this kind of space that needs to be filled with something. And there's potential for many different types of feelings. It's interesting that CERFI would then, away from Laborde, if there's something that's consistent throughout their practice, is actually in every organization guaranteed that you have a rhythm of meetings with no agenda, precisely as an analytical device. It's raining, and why the hell do we all go there? There's no clear purpose, but we go. And that is interesting because that brings things into visibility that they can otherwise probably would not. And I think that's something that we forget. If we just have a conversation, there's certain types of things that come to mind that shift if our conversation is happening while we walk, or if it's a conversation in response to why you didn't decide to do the laundry or answer phones on that week, right? They're just mechanisms to pick up more stuff that's bodily stuff, environmental stuff that is part of a bodily machinic unconscious, so to speak. In terms of then, very quickly, in terms of the point, CERFI, they say it in a brutal way. We don't want to be like those people who go to the countryside and run away from capitalism. That's not necessarily my point. I have a far more complicated position in terms of that. But CERFI, no, they're very clear at the time. We don't want to do US style, go to the middle of the desert and with our teepees. They say it like that. If the problem is the state, we want to stay here. If the state is one of the key machineries of capitalism, well, in order to fight it, we need to stay here. We cannot escape to the countryside. And so for them, and I think that's beautiful, a line of flight is closer. The English translation is tough because it means carries the idea of a way. Is better understood in terms of a return, staying with the trouble, perhaps in Donna Haraway, as an expression, right? A line of flight is to go into the collective equipment of the French state, which is the epicenter of hyperstate bureaucracy, and try to twist it, right? For them, a line of flight would not be to go to the countryside. That would be addressing a different type of problem, perhaps. So they're very blunt, but that's why part of my answer in relation to you would perhaps sit outside of this conversation, because I personally have a more nuanced relation to that problem.
I mean, I would say that it has to be done. You cannot think whether to do it or not do it. It's about, if there's enough people, there's that symptom, people want to gather in the rural environment and do readings. If there's enough, it has to be done to see what happens then. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And this is something they would apply like that as well. Just do it. You can't really think about it. And maybe just do it with more people. So there's more ideas around it and it's not so complicated. Yeah, if there's at least 2 people who want to do it, why not?
Yeah, I have to say that I'm becoming very inspired in the context of this conversation to start thinking again in these terms. And one of the things that I'm taking away, and of course from reading the introduction to your book, CERFI Analysis Everywhere, I think there might be a distinction to be made between, let's say, the European imagination and the American imagination with respect to how these incipient radical desires play out. And just to follow what you're saying, Susana, if that's what the imagination looks like, that's where the exploration begins, where the conversations start happening. Whereas, Godofredo, like what you're saying, for the French, they're going right to the heart of the bureaucracy to begin that twist. To each their own in some respect, but I think it gives me more confidence to approach that experiment. But also, I'm hearing intimations of certain tools and analytical methodologies that could be used and applied in these spaces, which makes me think that at some point, Godofredo and Susana, I'm just going to have to request your services as a kind of consultant as we move forward with these activities together.
I think it really helps to imagine that everything is a trial. We seem to have banished the word trial from everything, but we just try things.
Yeah, in the UK, it's like, we can't try things. We need this now. And we're still arguing about the meeting agenda.
No, you need to know what you're going to do.
10 different WhatsApp groups have started based on what agendas we'd like, based on what books we've read at various kind of the same conference. And it's the romance of British Trotskyism. Every time a Trotskyist group splits into three, an angel gets its wings. And so what would be ideal to ask about in terms of these trials? Yeah. Okay, good. It's universal. In terms of these interventions, in terms of this research into trials and making everything an analytic situation, two of the main terms that come up from the book is a term that originally it comes from architecture, which is the idea of programming and the idea of equipment, and indeed the idea of collective equipment. So I just wanted to ask how exactly they use these terms, because it seems very abstract from the outset, and then they move it into these applications and the various histories of their attempts at doing these kinds of research. For example, I was quite taken by the example of the educational TV programming in the Ivory Coast, their approach to that. And so I wanted to ask about what does it mean for CERFI, you know, say we want to produce collective equipment. Can we give some historical examples of what sort of projects they did? Because if you get this book, there's a huge amount of visual research about the music groups they had, about the radio groups, the TV groups, group ties. I know Franco helped out with some of this research. Bifo, it really was a multimedia project at a time which all of these were quite new. Sometimes it was literally equipment, but sometimes in theory, here equipment is this is a technical term. Is Simone Doan here somewhere?
Well, you mentioned Trotskyists. Well, first, thank you for picking that up, actually, because a lot of the work that was done on these authors and then this work tends to come from history and philosophy, i.e. it tends to, as a format, even though one speaks of semiotics and this and that, as a format is a bunch of words. And we really wanted, even CERFI publishing about themselves, words like their magazines, text, and we wanted to bring about a kind of polyphony of modes of existence, and not all of the groups in CERFI published. So there's a kind of imbalance in terms of how much of it was accessible, and we spent quite a lot of time bringing visual materials into play so that other people can pick up on. Your speaking also reminded me, your Trotskyist comment, one of these places that they started programming was FNAC, which is a I don't know if in the UK it's not a thing. In Portugal, FNAC is one of our main media shops and music shops and etc. for vinyls and CDs and headphones and AI stuff and whatever. FNAC at the time was a Trotskyist federation of shops. So what? It was quite beautiful. So programming and collective equipment. When they come out of that kind of foundational moment in 1967, there's these two characters that were part of Shady. And they had this profession that I had never heard before. It doesn't exist like that in the UK or in Portugal, which is the places where I've practiced as an architect, or studied or teach, which is the programmer. The programmer is an institutional figure that would be in English terms, the person who writes the brief. Right? And the brief is the brief that is given to architects. If I have a house, I want one kitchen connected to the living room. That's a UK refurbishment nowadays, right? 2 bathrooms, 1 this, 1 that, 5 of this, 3 bedrooms, whatever, right? Or 5 hospitals, this, that. What I identify is that that is a space where the state would calculate demands through statistical means, right? But actually, and you're always debating the numbers of things, but not actually, why do we need hospitals in the first place? Or you never really question the logic of the demand, right? To put it bluntly. So they thought in there, well, this is an interesting space to occupy, this hyper-bureaucratic position, which is neither the architect, nor the client, nor the consultant, nor it's somewhere in between, and it's a space of negotiation between all of them, right? So it's a super complicated, super bureaucratic space. They were really, really interested in it. And of course, they're programming this thing, which in the French state, in English, would be more like collective facilities. But we use the term collective equipment also because that's the way in which Andy Goffey has translated it. And it worked really well for us, even before we started this work. It translated in relation to the book Lines of Light. So that is a term from the French state. So both programming and collective equipment is the view of the state in terms of managing its machinery of normativity and whatever, right? What they do is to completely transform them. For them, programming equals research, and research equals analysis, and programming equals analysis. They do a kind of an equivalence there in a way, so to speak, or equally to self-management, right? So we need to collectivize programming. Collectivized programming is to question the demand. Therefore, you're investigating the demand, which means that you're investigating your social political continuum. So these things become synonyms very quickly in a way, right? Programming, analysis, research as an analytical process, so on and so forth. And which means that it cannot be done by someone external to it, right? So it's not the position of the consultant that comes in. It's always the position of catalyzing collective analytical, collective investigative processes into. And programming, if you imagine, let's say, that Asset Horizon requires new facilities, just the collective conversations of programming that, what we really need and why, and to understand that that is part of self-management. And Guattari would say there's no self-management without programming, there's no programming without self-management, right? You cannot have one without the other, as a kind of collectivization. So that's where the two terms come in, and that's how they try to twist them. And then they'll twist them. So in Ivory Coast, very quickly, I just want to throw a few examples because that's what you kind of wanted, right? So in Ivory Coast, they get a commission that they had a friend with a daughter of this and that, to work together with UNESCO. And so this is immediately after decolonization, with the Ivory Coast Education Ministry and with the British Ministry of Cooperation, and they were French Ministry of Cooperation, and they were essentially supposed to brought in to program audiovisual education for schools. So basically someone on a TV, and you have TV programs to teach through TV, through audiovisual, right? Throughout Ivory Coast. And they'll go and say, hell no, that doesn't work. What you need is to create a kind of diagrammatic first program, but then to constitute teams of local teachers who then would program themselves and actually would program continuously. So their reaction to programming is in a way to say no. It's either no, we refuse to program, you should too, or unless it's a collective process of self-management through which you reflect and analyze through programming. So it's kind of so in Ivory Coast, they lose that war. They don't manage to convince them and they get fired. But that's their commitment. You cannot program just like that at a distance. When they do that in the new towns is actually quite interesting, because then they try to bring programming through collectivizing a series of meetings between stakeholders. They try to bring in non-academics and non-professionals, the inhabitants, which for the French state was like, what are the inhabitants supposed to be doing here? They didn't want that. They want to have economists and psychoanalysts and psychiatrists and planners together. The French state wasn't into that either. There's a moment in which they say, how about instead of norms, we come up with differential norms? Since you want norms and you want numbers, let's norms that adjust. The French state wasn't into that either. They also want to produce nomadic teams of programmers, which is the collective of all the stakeholders that are ongoing programming of the new towns. As you might imagine, the new towns of all bureaucratic programs that you can engage with is one that brings together central planning plus local planning plus new planning facilities. So they really go to the heart of it in a very Trotskyist way, if you want. But of course, they try. I think there's a few cases that, again, are very different from that I think is interesting. So they also try that, this kind of militancy, analytical militancy is basically analysis everywhere, right? So they try it through the programming of state facilities, but they also try it in a case that is really, really beautiful, in the constitution of a popular atelier of urbanism in Almagar. So, and that's one of the dividers that we have with archival material. So there's a master plan from the municipality that will dispossess and evict an entire working class neighborhood. They come together with militant organizations there, and they constitute a popular planning department from the population, organized and led by the population. And they managed to win that. And they implemented their counter master plan. And that process was beautiful because, again, you see the process of doing the counter master plan was simply a new master plan as an object, as an alternative. What really was powerful was the collective analytical process. Because, of course, in participating and in leading that process, the community, the ideas that came into it weren't simply a repetition of the community that pre-existed, right? So it's a beautiful collective research project by the community, again, with weekly meetings. And so it's quite beautiful. And I don't know, there's other cases, does it occur to you more, with a few of them, that there's the video one, for example?
Yeah, there's a very interesting, because in the book we try to bring all this polyphony, all these different dimensions that are not just based on language. That's really important for us, because there's members of CERFI that have not written a paper, and that doesn't mean that they didn't have a very interesting contribution. Actually, in fact, from the interviews we've done, those things in the margins were the most important ones, were the ones that were kind of bring fuel to the whole group. And one example that was told by us by François Papin, who is a filmmaker. Actually, he worked at Labor. He was studying to become a psychiatrist. But in Labor, he found this passion for video, and he's now a filmmaker. And it's because of him that we have so many, even footage of Labor, for example. And he told us that at a certain point, they founded this thing that's called the CERFI Imago, which was a video club in which they filmed different institutions. They would go to psychiatric hospital, for example. They would teach the patients to use the camera rather than, because, in psychiatry, there was this thing of the gaze of the doctor, right? You always examine the patient, and we all have this vision of a team of 10 doctors kind of talking about the patient as if he's not there. So they wanted to invert that, and they taught the patients how to use video cameras and stuff and etc. And it tells this really kind of interesting story, which goes back to thinking about method or the absence of method. They went to this psychiatric hospital in Nantes, I think, to teach the patients to use the camera. And whilst they're there was one of the patients, the police came to the hospital and detained one of the patients, and they didn't really understand why and what was happening. And then they participated in this meeting of staff and doctors and nurses. They are discussing this episode, and they were filming the meeting. And basically what happened is that it was one of the patients of the hospital that was in love with one of the workers of the hospital. So he was going to the city center by her house, kind of waiting for her to come down, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the directors of the hospital decided that they had to call police in, which is kind of a huge thing. How do you call the police in, this force into a hospital to sort this out without kind of activating different mechanisms? So they filmed this meeting, and there was huge discussions. Then the footage of this meeting was seen by other staff and workers who were not in the meeting. And because of the footage, lots of kind of nurses organized against the directors in the hospital. So this, because they were there and because they were filming and because this footage circulated, something very precious happened in the terms of the contestation to the hospital direction. And this is something they do as well, kind of in lots of research projects that they have in the program. And they use the camera and the video. They just have video cameras there to be used. And then to be used and reused, and maybe something could happen. And in some cases, it did happen. And it's interesting because in this team of the Club Imag, we interviewed a couple of people, and one of them was saying, but there's no method. I don't understand what we're trying to do because there's no method. And he tells me this story, which is beautiful. Well, it seems as if something worked.
Yeah, it's beautifully democratic, as particularly the video camera example pertinent today in terms of not necessarily the obliteration of method, but also democratization of practice. Terms of information, and it's a term that can get lost. I think sometimes we talk about programming, because I think when some people might hear programming, it's always about this idea in advance, this cut-off point, kind of like computer programming. Yeah. And I think one of the things that your book shows actually that when we think of organizational programming, it actually becomes more democratic, not less, because it's all about this feedback process of self-management. But Craig, I know you had something to say before we head off.
Yeah, I mean, since we're in the home stretch of this conversation and we're on the topic of method, I think one thing that's important to me and probably to a lot of our listeners who are getting interested in this topic is what literary resources are at our disposal to educate those of us in the Anglophone world who don't have access to all the French materials. In terms of methods and practical methods, of course, we have Guattari's works, like I said, compiled in Psychoanalysis and Transversality on semiotext. We have the machinic unconscious and the essays in there. But in terms of the practical dimension, are there, beyond your book, which I think, just having read a short portion of it, the introduction and some of the introductory chapters, which intimate some of the contours of the practice, where are we to turn if we want to educate ourselves more about these methods?
Good question.
First of all, to the book.
Well, yeah, first read the book. No, there's something we haven't mentioned, and coming also from architectural background, psychology, and a philosophical background. When we were doing this book, we really had to, I think you agree with this, but we haven't really discussed it, kind of suspend certain philosophical concepts because we wanted to be with CERFI. So we did not project onto CERFI concepts that kind of to help it circulate more. There's schizoanalysis, obviously, that's implicated. And that's one of the reasons we kind of published in the book, I'm sorry to mention the book again, a series of kind of collective discussions between them. And I think they're not documents on how to organize, but they show what usually we don't show. They show that you don't measure the success of a militant organization or a militant project by lack of conflict, by lack of kind of different opinions, by how long did it lasted. We try to fight back this question of, but why did CERFI end it? And we fight back this question because I think it does not do much for us to measure militancy in those terms. It makes much more sense to think about things that are porous and then transform in others, and there's trials. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. So do you have suggestions for reading? I think it's kind of more of an attitude, kind of those texts that we translated that show all those collective discussions, sometimes that have to do with very banal options in daily life, I think are quite precious. And the fact that there's so much polyphony. They have music groups, they have video cycle clubs, they have therapy by letters, they had fashion people kind of designing costumes for them to wear. So it shows there's kind of a healthy production of institutions because they're so diverse. But you've asked about resources. Yeah, resources, Godofredo.
So a couple of things I would say. I'll add on what you said, which is, in a way, we there's a natural, because we arrived to this work on the back of what we know thus far, which tends to be Guattari, and there's a tendency of focusing on concepts like schizoanalysis and transversality, that CERFI don't use them. We use them sometimes just to, in a way, to locate the book in the field, but CERFI, they don't feel the need to use it. Actually, Anne Quérien was a very important person in CERFI and was very important in helping us develop this work. There was a moment, and we quote that she's writing a book on education. She's writing a research report on mutualist education in France. And at one point she's saying, well, and I felt that I need to mention Foucault and this and that. And it was just blocking me. So I gave up on Foucault and I just wrote. And I think CERFI, quite a lot of it is there. They didn't have a kind of a common conceptual agreement. They had, if anything, an agreement to disagree together, which is, I think, one of the loveliest possible ways of it. They loved each other very much, even though they would disagree profoundly, even politically, at certain points or around certain topics. And so the book is written as an invitation to partake in analytical practices. And is an invitation not just done to philosophers who might be familiar with Guattari, or psychoanalysts, let's say, your psychoanalysts and philosophers or artists who might already be familiar with some of his figures, but actually is an invitation to people reading these from organization studies, from social work, engage in militant organizing, be it in the urban center or in the countryside, doesn't really matter. And actually the importance and an invitation to partake in analytical practices and take every thing that you have to do in whatever it is, there's an analytical opportunity there that is quite important in order to keep capitalist subjectivities at bay, right? And so in terms of resources, this is not an attempt not to answer.
I actually have an answer now.
I have an answer. Sorry, I wanted to mention Anne-Kerrian himself, because one resource is Google Translate or something like that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Ask AI to translate. But the second resource is actually Anne-Kerrian's work. A lot of her work, there's a lot of things in English. But more importantly than that, I would really say is not to feel the need, unless you need to write an academic paper on this. I don't feel CERFI ever felt the need to read more Deleuze or to read more Guattari. If anything, they felt the need to stop reading for a while so that they could engage politically with Militant, organizing analytically and trying to figure out. Right. So I would maybe invite not to feel the need to read always before doing.
That's it, folks. Stop reading now. Our stock is going down.
Stop reading now. Stop. Yeah, that's a great advice to a friend. No, but now I think I was going to say something similar. So it's the non-response. I was going to say that, I mean, for example, I usually understand theory much better when I understand why it was produced and why do you seek a certain piece of theory. For example, understanding why the Black Panthers read Fanon. It makes sense. They were searching for something like that to make sense of their circumstances and what to do with it. And so I think that, I mean, we shouldn't say that, but we probably don't need more books. We need more people doing more things, writing more books and friends reading each other's books and producing things together, either concepts or ideas or films or letter clubs or things like that. That's what I would say. I think, yeah, that's what I would say.
Also a non-answer.
Also a non-answer. But you probably have a very good answer. I'm sure.
No, I started joining organizations to get away from theory, and then turns out I needed theory to work out what was going wrong there. So that was a decent point of reconciliation.
But I think it's different from organizations. I think it's really important organizations not to get away from theory. Yeah. But I think theory has to be imminent to organizing, right?
There's no escape.
It cannot be a kind of a projection. I need to, I need, quite on the contrary. And I think that's, if there's something beautiful about CERFI, you have to organize who cleans the bathroom. You cannot. And that's an important theoretical moment there. That is not to be wasted away, so to speak, and kind of, because it produces all sorts of crystallizations, right? I just want to speak about revolutionary organizing, and I don't want to dedicate myself to who brings water to a demonstration, who is going to take care of the kids, who is going to pay taxes on the property that were rented, whatever, right? There's a bunch of things that are the core to life and to organizing that need to be brought as worthy of conceptual attention in organizing. And so they're very much into theory, but might be the theory of organizing your schedules for cleaning the bathroom and what is at stake with that.
I mean, just do the theory you need. That's what I would say.
Well, I'll say just in the context of this conversation, just the concept of crystallization, especially as Adam and Emma and I are attempting to cultivate this para-academic institution in the sense of institution that we're working with here. I think one of the things at the outset is breaking through preconceptions, practices, the way that schools are conducted. What are, for example, some of the assumptions that we import from existing academia that just don't work in this space? And what are ways that we can mobilize action without relying upon financialization, but understanding that that's important to maintain the cohesiveness and interest and the viability of the group in terms of just people's livelihoods, people getting paid, making sure that they can get something to eat, which is something that you folks highlight in the book itself, right? This is part of the transversal, the spirit of democracy, but distributed differently amidst transversal relations.
And I think I want to pick on something because maybe to throw it, it's always better to work with examples, right? And I don't want to make your example of High Horizon now as a kind of as a mechanism to develop.
Oh, please do. Please do. Please do.
But for example, the programming that needs to take place, but at the level of content, but at the level of your own investment in terms of time, at the level of distribution of money, at the level of organization of spaces. I think the key to CERFI, they didn't have any good model or labor, whatever, to say this is how it works best, right? What they had is a model of keep on reworking it. So that, for example, in their most intensive object of programming was themselves, actually, as a group, right? As a collective libidinal experiment. And so they've tried things that, again, to mix results depending on how you see it, right? Collectivizing polyfunctionality is very important so that everyone passes through the other kind of positions, at least for a while, not to avoid totally any identifications. People have preferences to things, right? And competencies. But to pass through what it means to take the role of cleaner, director, this and that, not to inhabit and identify our relation to the collective process as a kind of a identified with a role, right? To produce this alienation aspect of it, right? And we list in the book, I won't go through it, but we list a series of things that they do. And one of them, perhaps to conclude maybe from my side on that point, is what we fake call a preface, right? Our preface is a story that was told to Susana by Jean-Claude Pollack, who was a clinician. And I don't know if you want to tell that story, but it's a story, let's say, of how, for example, CERFI would receive money from the state. And they would do part of the contract that they said, but they would mobilize that money to fund a bunch of research that would never be fundable, right? And to allow, and not in a conversation as we would have, for example, in the UK, what's the impacts and beneficiaries of this research, right? But it's actually, well, if you want to do it, well, might as well do it and let's see what comes out of it, even if I might think it's completely ridiculous. Let's try it out. Let's see how it goes, right? Not to stay with a kind of repression of, I don't think it might work. And so there's this story, I don't know, I think it's better you share it because it's told to you, it's beautiful.
Yeah. So, I mean, we started a book with it and it's one of the stories that gets told and I think it works very well. So Jean-Claude Pollack was a doctor at Labor and tells this story. And he tells the story that there was the Patients Club at Labor, and it's kind of an autonomous institution from Labor financially. They would gather their own money and they would decide how to use the money. And they'd have these regular meetings. And in one of those meetings, you're thinking about how to spend money that they had. They had suddenly lots of money and they needed to spend it. And one patient that did not usually come to those meetings, was not really an active member, etc., almost had to be forced to come in, said, well, I think you should give me a bicycle. And then everyone reacted very quickly and said, well, why should I give you a bicycle? Even it's not that you do anything here. And then Guattari was there, he was listening, and he said, he intervened like this, and he said, but why would we not give him a bicycle? Why do we repeat the same logics of capitalism? Why? Maybe something can happen. If he really wants it, maybe something can happen. Maybe something can totally change. And he did, because they gave him the bicycle. And then, I mean, he did, but maybe he didn't have to, but he got the bicycle and suddenly lots of other people got bicycles and then the patients formed a bicycle club and they started to go around the different villages and etc. So it's all about not importing models, kind of always trying to see the very concrete situation. That's why you cannot really apply things from one place to the other. See the very concrete situation and what can you catalyze out of that? Not apply models and rules and grids. Like you said, you just make things as you go along, really.
But they're open to it, right? And that's quite beautiful.
So listeners, if you want to experiment with new modes of organization beyond the perpetual infinite WhatsApp spiraling all the way down and the anarchist draw wheel, we are talking to both of our comrades in the anarchist and sort of Marxist spectrums here. Pick up Analysis Everywhere. It is out now with minor compositions. We'll link it down the show. You can get it in paperback. Come on, it's always better to feel these things in the physical, and you'll never know what the encounter might do.
It's a beautiful book too. Full color, nice sort of salmon colored motif.
You get to see the desiring machine. It's a band. Desiring machines aren't purely diagrammatic. Sometimes they involve riffs, which is really heartening if you're too stuck in the theory world. You want to take it out there. I want to say, Susana, Godofredo, thank you so much for joining us today. Cheers for explaining to us the entire world of CERFI, history of organizational practice. We're definitely going to pick some of this up again because I think I've asked ourselves, we definitely need this. But thank you so much.
It was great. Oh, thank you. It was fantastic. And it's always nice to think about the book and to people trying to kind of do organizations and stuff. And we just love the podcast. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really great.